The map on the table is broad enough to cover most of the Western Soviet Union, but the eye keeps returning to one shape. It is a great bulge in the front line, pushing westward around the city of Kursk. To the north lies Orel, to the south lies Belgorod, and farther beyond it, Kharkov. Between those two German-held shoulders, the Soviet line bends outward in a vast arc. On a clean staff map, the shape appears simple. Two pincers, one from the north and one from the south, might close behind it. The salient would be cut away. Soviet formations inside it might be trapped. The front would become shorter. A victory might restore confidence after the catastrophe at Stalingrad. That was the idea. By the summer of 1943, however, ideas on the Eastern Front had a way of becoming something very different when they reached the ground. The German army that looked toward Kursk was not the same army that had crossed the Soviet frontier 2 years earlier. It remained dangerous, experienced, and tactically skillful. Its armored formations still contained men who understood movement, concentration, firepower, and the brutal tempo of mobile war. New weapons were arriving. Tiger tanks had already shown the power of their heavy guns and armor. Panther tanks promised a new combination of speed, protection, and long-range fire. Ferdinand tank destroyers carried enormous guns behind thick frontal armor. But beneath the machinery lay exhaustion. The fighting at Stalingrad had ended only months before. Entire formations had vanished. Other armies had escaped destruction, but had paid heavily during the winter battles. Germany was fighting not only a campaign, but a growing war of resources. Aircraft, fuel, trained crews, replacement tanks, experienced officers, mechanics, railway capacity, and time itself were all becoming harder to replace. Across the line, the Red Army was changing as well. The Soviet forces of 1943 were not the disorganized formations that had been shattered in the summer of 1941. They had learned through disaster, retreat, encirclement, winter offensives, and the grinding battles around Moscow and Stalingrad. Commanders had learned how to build defenses in depth. Infantry positions were linked more carefully. Artillery was massed more effectively. Anti-tank guns were organized into strong points. Engineers laid mines in quantities that would have been difficult to imagine during the first months of the invasion. Reserves waited behind the front, not merely to plug gaps, but to counterattack once an enemy had spent his strength. And at Kursk they had time. German planners could see the salient on their maps. Soviet planners could see it too. The longer that the Germans waited, the more trenches were dug, more mines disappeared beneath the soil, more wire was stretched. More gun positions were prepared, more roads were surveyed for the movement of reserves, more artillery firing data was collected. More units arrived behind the front. In this story, we will follow the German side of Operation Citadel, the hopes behind the plan, the arguments that delayed it, the men and machines assembled for the attack, the grinding advance through defenses that had been built specifically to receive them, and the moment when an operation designed to regain the initiative revealed instead how much the war had changed. This is not a story of machines alone. Kursk is often remembered through images of tanks, tigers in tall grass, panthers moving through dust, Soviet T-34s racing forward. Long gun barrels cutting across photographs, columns of smoke rising over open fields. But tanks did not move through empty space. They moved behind engineers clearing mines by hand under fire. They moved beside infantry carrying ammunition, radios, water, and machine guns. They depended on mechanics who worked through the night. They relied on artillery observers, bridge builders, fuel trucks, recovery vehicles, and roads that could turn to dust or mud depending on the weather. Every kilometer gained had to be supplied. Every damaged vehicle had to be recovered if it was to fight again. Every delay gave defenders more time to react. And above all of it was the map. A great bulge around Kursk. A northern pincer. A southern pincer. Two arrows meant to meet. In a quiet room, by the light of a lamp, the plan could still look elegant. On the ground, the summer of 1943 was waiting. When the last organized resistance of the German Sixth Army ended at Stalingrad in early 1943, the shock traveled far beyond the ruined city on the Volga. The defeat was military, political, and psychological. For years, German propaganda had presented the Wehrmacht as a force that might be slowed, but not truly broken. There had been retreats before. There had been losses. Yet the destruction of an entire field army was different. Tens of thousands of men had gone into captivity. A field marshal had surrendered. The name Stalingrad became a symbol before the smoke had even cleared. But the Eastern Front did not stop. Even as one catastrophe ended, operations continued across hundreds of kilometers. Soviet forces pressed westward with confidence. German formations withdrew, reorganized, and fought to prevent the winter crisis from becoming a general collapse. In the south, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein managed a series of counterstrokes that recaptured Kharkov in March. The operation did not erase Stalingrad, but it stabilized a dangerous situation. German armored formations still possessed the ability to concentrate quickly and strike Soviet forces that had outrun their supplies and become dispersed during the winter advance. The recapture of Kharkov mattered for another reason. When the front settled, the line around Kursk formed a huge salient. Soviet armies held the city and the broad territory around it. German forces remained to the north around Orel and to the south around Belgorod. To German operational thinking, such a shape was difficult to ignore. Salients invited attack. If the base of a salient could be cut, troops inside might be surrounded. If the Kursk bulge could be eliminated, the German front would become shorter. Divisions might be released for other tasks. Soviet reserves might be destroyed in a battle chosen by Germany rather than in another defensive crisis. The temptation was particularly strong because the German command urgently wanted a victory that could restore the strategic initiative. The year 1942 had begun with enormous ambitions. German armies had driven toward the Caucasus and the Volga. By the beginning of 1943, those ambitions had ended with retreat from the Caucasus and disaster at Stalingrad. Something had to be done. Yet what could still be done was becoming a harder question. Germany no longer possessed unlimited freedom of action. The war in North Africa was nearing its end. Allied air power was growing. The threat of invasion in the Mediterranean and eventually Western Europe demanded forces. German cities were increasingly exposed to bombing. Industry could produce impressive new weapons, but production numbers alone did not solve the deeper shortages of fuel, trained crews, spare parts, and experienced manpower. On the Eastern Front, every major offensive now represented a gamble. To attack meant gathering valuable armored formations in one place. It meant consuming fuel and ammunition at a rate that could not continue indefinitely. It meant exposing new tanks to mines, artillery, breakdowns, and enemy fire. It meant accepting losses among veteran crews that were harder to replace than the vehicles themselves. But to remain on the defensive carried dangers too. The Red Army was growing stronger. Soviet industry east of the old front line was producing enormous quantities of weapons. Command structures were improving. Artillery and armor were being used more coherently. If Germany surrendered the initiative completely, then Soviet commanders would choose the time and place of the next great battle. Operation Citadel emerged from this tension. The concept was straightforward. 9th Army would attack southward from the Ural region. 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf would attack northward from the Belgorod area. The pincers would meet east of Kursk, cutting off the salient. The distances did not appear impossible. The northern attack would not need to reach the city itself if it could drive deeply enough to meet the southern force. The southern attack would move through open country where German armored formations had previously demonstrated their strengths. But the plan contained a contradiction from the beginning. A successful double envelopment depended on speed and surprise. The preparations for Citadel provided less and less of either. The front had become quiet enough that large troop movements were difficult to hide. Soviet intelligence gathered information from many sources. The shape of the front itself pointed toward the obvious possibility of a German attack. As weeks passed, the defenders did not need to know every detail. They needed only to prepare the most likely avenues of advance. And still the attack was delayed. Part of the delay came from the desire to strengthen the assault force with new weapons. Hitler had high expectations for the Panther. The Tiger had already established a reputation as a powerful heavy tank. The Ferdinand promised to destroy enemy armor at long range. If enough of these vehicles could be gathered, perhaps technology might restore the margin Germany had lost in manpower and production. Commanders disagreed. Some argued that the offensive should begin early, before the Soviets could reinforce the salient further. Others questioned whether the operation should be launched at all. Still others believed that waiting for new equipment would make the difference. Every week altered the balance. The German side received more tanks. The Soviet side received more trenches, mines, artillery positions, reserves, and time to study the battlefield. The spring thaw dried. Fields became passable. The grass grew higher, and the men on both sides waited. For German soldiers in the assembly areas, the waiting could feel strangely detached from the scale of what was being prepared. A tank crew might spend a morning checking track tension. Mechanics worked on engines. Infantrymen cleaned rifles and listened to rumors. Officers studied maps with villages circled in pencil. Fuel trucks arrived. Ammunition was stacked. Engineers inspected equipment for clearing obstacles. Orders changed. Dates moved. The attack was always approaching, but for weeks it did not arrive. Behind the Soviet lines, men dug. That simple fact would shape everything that followed. To understand Operation Citadel, it helps to forget the dramatic photographs for a moment and return to geography. The Kursk salient was not a single battlefield. It was a region. From north to south it stretched across a broad section of the Eastern Front, encompassing towns, villages, ridges, streams, railways, farms, patches of woodland, and long open fields. The terrain did not resemble a flat tabletop. Small rises controlled observation. Villages became strong points. Ravines and streams interrupted movement. Roads mattered because wheeled vehicles and supply columns could not simply move anywhere with equal ease. The northern and southern shoulders of the salient were also different. In the north, General Walter Model's Ninth Army faced a dense defensive zone. The ground offered fewer opportunities for the kind of wide, armored maneuver associated with earlier German campaigns. Soviet positions around important approaches, such as Ponyri, were prepared for heavy fighting. In the south, 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth and forces of Army Detachment Kempf had more room to employ armor. The southern attack would eventually make the deeper penetration, but it too would encounter layered defenses, minefields, anti-tank positions, and repeated counterattacks. The German plan tried to turn the shape of the salient into an advantage. If two strong forces struck toward one another, Soviet troops inside the bulge might be forced to react in several directions at once. Their reserves could be drawn into battle. A successful meeting of the pincers would create an encirclement. This was familiar operational thinking. German victories earlier in the war had often come from movement rather than simply from destroying enemies at the front line. Armored spearheads penetrated, bypassed resistance, and moved into rear areas. Infantry followed. Supply routes were cut. Command posts were displaced. Large groups of enemy soldiers found themselves surrounded. At Kursk, however, the Soviet command intended to deny the Germans the conditions required for that kind of battle. The defense was not a thin crust. It was built in depth. By the summer of 1943, Soviet defensive practice had changed dramatically from the first year of the war. Rifle formations no longer depended on isolated strong points, spread across enormous fronts. Trenches were connected. Defensive belts were layered. Anti-tank guns were grouped. Reserves existed at several levels. Engineers prepared obstacles not only at the forward edge, but farther behind it. The purpose was not to make every meter impossible to capture. That would have been unrealistic. The purpose was to absorb momentum. An attacking force might break through the first position and still discover another line ahead. It might clear one minefield and encounter another. It might destroy a group of anti-tank guns only to come under fire from a second position placed deeper in the defense. Every pause mattered. A tank that stopped because engineers had to clear a lane was a tank exposed to artillery. An infantry unit that became separated from its supporting armor could be pinned. A column forced onto a narrow, cleared route became easier to target. A damaged vehicle might block movement behind it. A successful local penetration could become a trap if reserves arrived before the attacker had reorganized. The Soviets also prepared for the possibility that German armored units would break through. Tank and mechanized formations waited behind the defensive belts. They were not all placed directly at the front. Some were held at operational depth, available to move toward the most dangerous penetration. This was important because no commander could know exactly where the German effort would achieve its greatest success. The German command understood that Soviet defenses were strengthening. Reconnaissance flights photographed positions. Patrols brought back information. Interrogations and intelligence reports added details. Yet maps could not fully represent what the landscape was becoming. A line on a map might mean several trench systems. A marked minefield might have been expanded after the map was printed. A village might contain dug-in anti-tank guns. A ridge that looked insignificant could hide artillery observers. A route judged suitable for tanks could become blocked by destroyed vehicles within minutes. The longer the preparations continued, the more the Kursk salient became a machine designed to consume time. And time was precisely what the German offensive could not afford to lose. The two pincers needed to maintain pressure. They needed to prevent the Soviets from shifting reserves. They needed to penetrate deeply enough that the threat of encirclement became real. They needed to do this before losses reduced their strength and before Soviet counteroffensives elsewhere forced German commanders to divert attention. There was another problem. The attack itself had become predictable. A salient with German forces on both shoulders practically advertised the axis of advance. The precise tactical routes were not obvious, but the strategic geometry was. The Soviets could prepare accordingly. That did not mean the German attack would be weak. Far from it. The formations assembled for Citadel included some of the most experienced units in the German army. The concentration of armor was formidable. The Luftwaffe still had the ability to deliver powerful local support. German artillery planning was extensive. Engineers were prepared to open routes through obstacles. The coming battle would not be a simple story in which one side possessed every advantage. German formations would achieve penetrations. Soviet units would suffer severe losses. Some defensive positions would be overrun. Many Soviet tank attacks would be costly. But the question was larger than whether individual engagements could be won. Could the German forces maintain enough momentum to turn tactical success into operational success? Could the northern and southern attacks meet? Could the salient actually be cut off? That was the standard by which Citadel had to be judged. And the map, with its clean arrows, could not answer. By the spring of 1943, the argument over Kursk was not simply an argument about one battlefield. It was an argument about what Germany should do with the strength it still possessed. There were commanders who looked at the Eastern Front and saw danger in delay. The Red Army was recovering quickly. Every month brought more tanks, more artillery, more trained formations, and more defensive preparation. If Germany intended to attack the Kursk salient, it seemed logical to strike before the Soviet position became stronger. There were also commanders who doubted the entire concept. A prepared enemy waiting behind multiple defensive belts was not the opponent German mobile doctrine preferred to face. Why attack the strongest part of the Soviet front merely because its shape on the map appeared convenient? Some preferred a more flexible strategy. Germany might remain on the defensive, allow Soviet forces to attack, then use armored reserves to counterattack exposed formations. This would place the burden of crossing minefields and prepared fire zones on the Red Army. It might preserve German strength while still creating opportunities for mobile warfare. But defensive strategy carried political and psychological costs. After Stalingrad, a passive posture could appear to confirm that Germany had lost the initiative. Hitler wanted a victory. He wanted to damage Soviet offensive power before it could be used elsewhere. He also hoped that new armored vehicles would give German troops an important technical advantage. The discussion became increasingly tied to machines. The Panther was at the center of these hopes. On paper, it was an impressive vehicle. Its long 75mm gun could defeat enemy armor at great distances. Its sloped frontal armor offered strong protection. It had been developed partly in response to the shock produced by the Soviet T-34. But a tank is more than armor thickness and gun performance. It is an engine, a transmission, a cooling system, a fuel system, tracks, road wheels, electrical components, optics, radios, a maintenance organization, a recovery problem when it breaks down, and, most importantly, a crew that understands how to use it. The Panthers being gathered for Citadel were new. Many had not gone through the long process of operational use that reveals weaknesses and teaches crews and mechanics how to manage them. Mechanical problems appeared even before battle. Vehicles could be lost without a Soviet gun firing a shot. The Ferdinand presented a different compromise. Its frontal protection and powerful 88mm gun made it extremely dangerous to enemy tanks at range. But the original vehicle lacked a machine gun for close defense. It was heavy and difficult to recover. In terrain filled with mines, infantry, artillery, and obstacles, its strengths could not always be used cleanly. The Tiger was more mature, but it too was a heavy and maintenance-intensive machine available only in limited numbers. German propaganda and later popular history often made these vehicles seem like the center of the battle. They were not. Most German armored vehicles at Kursk were not Tigers. Infantry still had to seize ground. Engineers still had to clear mines. Artillery still had to suppress defenses. Older Panzer models still made up much of the armored force. Assault guns continued to play important roles. Supply columns remained vulnerable to breakdowns, congestion, air attack, and road conditions. The fascination with new weapons nevertheless influenced timing. Hitler postponed the operation while waiting for additional equipment. Each postponement had logic behind it. More Panthers might mean more combat power. More Tigers might strengthen the spearheads. More preparation might improve coordination. But postponement had a cost that was harder to measure because it existed on the enemy side of the line. Every extra German tank was arriving at a battlefield where more Soviet mines had also been laid. Every additional week for German training was also a week for Soviet engineers. Every new assault gun joined formations facing defensive systems that were becoming thicker. The balance could not be measured by counting German tanks alone. This was the central paradox of the waiting period. Germany was preparing more strength for the attack. The attack was becoming harder at the same time. By early July, the decision had been made. Citadel would go forward. The northern force under Model and the southern force under Manstein's Army Group South would strike toward Kursk. The operation was no longer a possibility on a planning table. Fuel had been issued. Ammunition had been moved forward. Artillery firing positions were occupied. Aircraft were prepared. Engineers waited near the front. Infantry moved into assault positions. Tank crews slept beside their vehicles when they could sleep at all. Many men knew enough to understand what was ahead. They had seen the defenses. They had heard the rumors. They knew the Soviets were expecting them. What they could not know was how the first hours would unfold. The Eastern Front had produced too many surprises for certainty. A minefield might delay an entire battalion. A village might collapse quickly. An artillery barrage might destroy communications. A tank company might find an unexpected gap. A Soviet unit might hold until nearly destroyed. Another might retreat before the assault arrived. The great operation would be made from thousands of such local events. But before any of them could happen, the waiting had to end. The name chosen for the offensive was Citadel. It suggested a fortress. Yet the German plan was not an attempt to storm the city of Kursk directly. The objective was the salient itself. From the north, 9th Army would drive south. From the south, 4th Panzer Army would drive north and northeast, supported on its flank by Army Detachment Kempf. If the two main thrusts met, Soviet armies inside the salient could be isolated. This required coordination across a battlefield so large that the northern and southern attackers would experience almost separate wars. Walter Model's 9th Army in the north faced terrain and defenses that favored a methodical approach. Model was known for careful preparation and later in the war for defensive skill. At Kursk, his formations would be expected to break through a heavily fortified zone where the Soviets had concentrated anti-tank weapons and fieldworks along likely axes. In the south, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army included powerful armored formations, among them the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The southern sector offered more room for movement, and would eventually produce the deepest German advance. Yet even here, movement depended on opening lanes. German engineers would have to work forward under fire. Minefields were not merely obstacles scattered randomly across open ground. They could channel vehicles toward positions already covered by artillery and anti-tank guns. Cleared lanes could become crowded. Vehicles leaving those lanes risked mines. The German assault plan relied heavily on fire support. Artillery would strike known Soviet positions. The Luftwaffe would attack artillery, reserves, armor, and strongpoints. Stuka dive bombers and other aircraft still possessed the ability to influence a local battlefield when German air units were concentrated. But Soviet air strength had grown. The air war over Kursk would be intense and costly. Neither side would enjoy the kind of effortless control German aircraft had possessed over some battlefields in 1941. The Soviet command, meanwhile, did not intend simply to wait passively. Knowing that a German offensive was likely, Soviet artillery prepared plans to strike German assembly areas and batteries. The opening of Citadel, therefore, began with an unusual sense that both sides were waiting for the same moment. Shortly before the main German assault, Soviet artillery opened fire against suspected German positions. The bombardment did not destroy the offensive. It caused disruption and confusion in places, but German units continued their preparations. Still, the psychological meaning was obvious. There would be no strategic surprise. The enemy was awake. In some sectors, German troops launched limited attacks before the main effort to secure observation points or improve positions. Then, in the early hours of July 5, 1943, the offensive began in full. Artillery fire rolled across the front. Engines started. Infantry moved forward. Armored vehicles advanced toward gaps engineers hoped to open. Dust rose from roads and fields. The attack that had been discussed for months was now reduced to immediate problems. Where is the minefield edge? Which trench is firing? Is the bridge intact? Where is the company commander? Can the radio reach battalion? Is that movement ahead friendly infantry or Soviet troops? Which route is clear? Where is the anti-tank gun? The grand arrows on the map disappeared inside such questions. For soldiers on the ground, the first day did not feel like a historical turning point. It felt like noise. Artillery, machine guns, engines, aircraft. Commands shouted near vehicles. The crack of high-velocity guns. The dull force of mines exploding beneath tracks. The first wounded moving backward. The first damaged tanks being examined by recovery crews. The first reports sent upward through headquarters. Some were optimistic. Positions had been taken. Enemy resistance had been broken in places. Other reports were less encouraging. Mines were dense. Soviet guns remained active. Progress was slower than planned. Units had become mixed. Vehicles had broken down. The shape of Citadel began to change almost immediately. An operation designed around penetration and convergence became, especially in the north, a battle of attrition against depth. In the south, German forces would gain more ground. But even there, the defenders would keep introducing new obstacles and new formations. The attack had begun. The race was no longer between German preparation and Soviet preparation. It was now a race between German momentum and Soviet reserves. There was also the problem of information. German intelligence did not enter Citadel blind. Reconnaissance had identified many Soviet defensive zones. German officers understood that the salient had been strengthened. They knew large reserves existed. They knew the attack would not repeat the surprise of 1941. But knowing that a defense is strong is not the same as knowing exactly how strong it will feel at the point of contact. Intelligence arrives in pieces. An aerial photograph shows trenches, but not the morale of the soldiers inside them. A prisoner identifies a unit, but may not know what waits behind it. Radio traffic suggests headquarters locations, but not every reserve route. A patrol discovers one minefield, but not the minefield laid the following night. Commanders then turn incomplete information into estimates. Every estimate contains judgment. How many Soviet divisions can be committed before the first line is broken? How quickly can reserves move? How badly will the artillery preparation disrupt the defense? How many German tanks will remain operational after several days? These questions could not be answered with certainty. The Soviet command had its own uncertainties. It knew the Germans were likely to attack the salient. It did not know every tactical decision. It did not know exactly how new German weapons would perform. It could not predict which defensive position would collapse first. So both sides built plans around uncertainty. The difference was that Soviet uncertainty favored depth. If the Germans attacked slightly farther east than expected, another belt still existed. If one rifle division failed, reserves waited. If one anti-tank position was bypassed, another might still engage. German uncertainty was more dangerous because Citadel depended on timing. If a minefield was denser than expected, the timetable slipped. If a new tank suffered more breakdowns than expected, the spearhead weakened. If one army advanced more slowly than the other, the pincers lost synchronization. In this sense, the German plan was more fragile. It required several assumptions to remain close enough to reality at the same time. The Soviet plan could tolerate more local failure because it had been designed around layers. This did not make Soviet victory automatic. It made the defense resilient. Resilience is often less dramatic than brilliance. But at Kursk, resilience was enough to defeat the idea at the center of Citadel. Before the first shot of Citadel, much of the hope surrounding the offensive had settled onto new armored vehicles. This was understandable. Germany faced an enemy with enormous industrial depth and growing numerical strength. A technical advantage offered one way to compensate. If one German tank could destroy several Soviet tanks before being knocked out, then perhaps quality might offset quantity. The logic was attractive. Reality was more complicated. The Tiger was the most famous of the new German heavy tanks. Its 88mm gun could destroy many Soviet tanks at ranges where return fire was far less effective. Its armor provided strong protection against common anti-tank weapons from the front. Used carefully, Tigers could dominate open ground. But heavy tanks were not magical. They were expensive, mechanically demanding, and few in number. A Tiger disabled by a mine was still disabled. A Tiger with a broken track required recovery. A Tiger could not occupy a trench. It could not clear a village alone. It depended on infantry, engineers, artillery, fuel, ammunition, and maintenance like every other tank. The Panther was supposed to become the new backbone of German armored warfare. Its design reflected lessons learned from fighting Soviet tanks. The front armor was sloped. The long gun was excellent. Its mobility promised the flexibility required for offensive operations. But Citadel came too early in the Panther's life. The vehicles had been rushed into service. Mechanical reliability was poor. Engines overheated. Final drive problems appeared. Fuel and oil leaks could create fires. Some vehicles failed during movement before they reached serious combat. The battalions equipped with Panthers entered one of the largest armored operations of the war, while still learning the behavior of the tank itself. This mattered because mechanical losses create a different kind of pressure from battle losses. A destroyed tank is gone. A broken tank might return, but only if recovery crews can reach it. Only if spare parts exist. Only if the repair organization has time. Only if the front does not move away. Only if the vehicle has not been damaged so badly that repair becomes unrealistic. During a fast advance, recovery can be difficult because support units lag behind. During a stalled offensive, damaged vehicles may remain close enough to repair areas, but the number of casualties can overwhelm maintenance capacity. The Ferdinand tank destroyer represented another attempt to gain superiority through firepower. Its 88mm gun was extremely effective against armor. Its frontal armor was formidable, but its weight and design created serious limitations. The lack of a whole machine gun on the initial version made close infantry threats dangerous. The vehicle was best suited to long-range engagements. Kursk did not always provide them. Minefields immobilized vehicles. Smoke reduced visibility. Terrain created dead ground. Infantry moved close. Artillery struck assembly areas. A weapon designed to dominate at distance could find itself fighting inside a chaotic, combined arms battlefield. The Soviet side had its own strengths and weaknesses. The T-34 remained one of the most important tanks in the Red Army. It was mobile, relatively well protected, and available in large numbers. By 1943, however, its 76mm gun was increasingly challenged by the frontal armor of newer German vehicles at long range. Soviet crews often needed to close the distance, maneuver for side shots, or rely on heavier guns and anti-tank weapons. The result was not a simple contest between a superior German tank and an inferior Soviet tank. Battlefield outcomes depended on who saw whom first. On range, on terrain, on mines, on artillery, on infantry, on crew skill, on whether a tank was moving or firing from concealment, on whether air attack disrupted a formation before it reached the fight, on whether radios allowed commanders to react quickly, on whether the crew had slept. Machines mattered. Systems mattered more. The German command's decision to wait for new tanks therefore produced a mixed result. More powerful vehicles reached the front, but the Soviets had used the same time to deepen their defense. A tank gun could destroy an anti-tank gun. It could not remove kilometers of defensive depth. Armor could punch through one position. It still had to continue moving, and every delay multiplied the number of problems behind the spearhead. Fuel vehicles had to find safe routes forward. Engineers had to mark lanes. Infantry had to remain connected to armor. Artillery had to relocate. Headquarters had to understand where the front actually was. The image of Kursk as a duel between famous tanks is compelling because machines are easy to photograph and compare. But Citadel would be decided by something less dramatic. Whether the attacking system could continue functioning under pressure. The German army was about to discover that even the most powerful gun could not shoot through time itself. There was another reason the new vehicles could not simply be counted as extra strength. They placed new demands on logistics. A heavy tank consumed more fuel than a lighter vehicle. It required stronger recovery equipment. Its tracks, road wheels, and drivetrain components created different maintenance needs. Ammunition for specialized guns had to reach the correct units in sufficient quantity. Mechanics needed manuals, tools, and spare parts for machines they had barely seen before. The supply system behind a panzer division was therefore as important as the tanks at its tip. A German armored formation moved with fuel trucks, ammunition columns, workshops, field kitchens, medical vehicles, communications equipment, and recovery tractors. These support elements did not have the armor protection of the fighting vehicles. They depended on roads and traffic control. A single blocked crossing or damaged bridge could slow an entire column. Citadel magnified the problem because so many valuable formations were concentrated into narrow sectors. Roads became crowded before the attack even began. Vehicles moved mostly at night to reduce observation. Dust revealed movement during daylight. Maintenance crews worked under blackout conditions. Fuel had to be stored close enough to support the offensive, but dispersed enough to reduce the danger of air attack and artillery. The German staff could calculate expected fuel consumption. War rarely followed the expected figure. A tank fighting through minefields burns fuel without gaining much distance. It idles. It reverses. It maneuvers around wrecks. It waits for engineers. It moves forward again. A division that advances 10 kilometers through resistance can consume more fuel and mechanical life than one that travels many times that distance on a road. The Soviets did not need to destroy every supply truck. They only needed to make German movement inefficient. This was another form of defensive success that did not appear in photographs. The waiting for tigers and panthers had been intended to increase combat power. It also increased the complexity of the force that had to be supported. And complexity under battlefield pressure becomes another source of friction. The German attack was built around movement. The Soviet defense was built around making movement expensive. By the summer of 1943, the Red Army had spent 2 years learning what happened when German armored formations were allowed to break through a front and continue moving into operational depth. The lessons had been brutal. In 1941, many Soviet divisions had been forced to defend enormous sectors with too little artillery, too few anti-tank weapons, weak communications, and almost no depth. German armored units often broke through narrow fronts and then exploited the gaps faster than Soviet headquarters could react. Entire armies were surrounded. That experience changed Soviet thinking. At Kursk, defenders prepared not one line, but a system of positions. The precise arrangement varied across the salient, but the principle was consistent. The first belts were meant to slow, disorganize, and expose the attacker. Behind them were further belts. Anti-tank guns were not distributed evenly. They were concentrated into areas where several weapons could support one another. Artillery positions were prepared to fire on likely routes. Infantry trenches were linked by communication trenches. Engineers created obstacles and laid mines in enormous quantities. A mine is a simple weapon. That simplicity can make its effect easy to underestimate. A minefield does not need to destroy every vehicle that enters it. It needs to change behavior. A tank commander who suspects mines slows down. Engineers move forward. Vehicles bunch together. A lane must be found or cleared. The attacker becomes predictable. And once vehicles are concentrated on a narrow path, artillery and anti-tank fire become more effective. At Kursk, minefields were often tied into defensive fire plans. That was the important point. The mine was not an isolated obstacle. It was part of a system. German engineers understood this and were trained for the task. They carried mine detectors, marking equipment, explosives, and tools. But clearing mines under battlefield conditions was exhausting and dangerous. A lane that looked safe might contain a second layer. A cleared path could become blocked by a damaged tank. Dust reduced visibility. Artillery fire scattered men. Night complicated marking. The defenders could also lay new mines in threatened sectors. Mobile obstacle detachments gave Soviet commanders the ability to reinforce a defense after the battle had already begun. The Red Army also prepared extensive artillery support. Soviet artillery had improved greatly since the early disasters of the war. Commanders had learned to mass fire more effectively. Gun positions were linked to observers. Pre-planned targets allowed batteries to strike routes, assembly areas, and likely breakthroughs. Rocket artillery added a distinctive sound to the battle. The Katyusha did not possess the accuracy of a conventional gun, but concentrated rocket salvos could saturate an area and produce a powerful psychological effect. Then there were the anti-tank guns. For German tank crews, the danger was rarely represented by a single dramatic weapon standing alone in a field. A more serious threat came from several guns positioned so that attacking one exposed a tank to another. Some were concealed until vehicles reached favorable ranges. Others opened fire early. Soviet infantry used anti-tank rifles against lighter vehicles, observation equipment, and vulnerable parts of tanks. Larger guns waited deeper. The goal was to force German armor to fight repeatedly. Destroy one position. Move forward. Find another. Move again. Encounter another minefield. Wait. Bring engineers. Call artillery. Advance. Repeat. This was defense by exhaustion. The Soviet command also understood that static defenses alone would eventually fail somewhere. No trench system is perfect. No minefield is continuous. No anti-tank belt can stop every attack. So reserves were central to the plan. Behind the tactical belts waited tank formations and additional armies. Their role was not to rush forward at the first sign of trouble. Ideally, they would be committed when German formations had already spent strength breaking through the forward zones. That distinction mattered. A fresh tank corps attacking a fresh German armored division on open ground might suffer badly. A fresh tank corps attacking a German force that had spent 2 days crossing minefields, repairing vehicles, and fighting through villages might have a very different effect. The battle would show that Soviet counterattacks were not always well coordinated. Some were costly. Some were launched too quickly. Some tank formations attacked in difficult terrain or without enough reconnaissance. But even failed counterattacks consumed German time. A German battalion forced to turn and fight was a battalion not moving toward Kursk. Behind all of this was an even larger plan. The Soviet defense of the Kursk salient was not intended as the final act. It was meant to prepare the way for offensive operations. Once the German attack had been weakened, Soviet forces outside the salient would strike. To the north, the Orel salient was vulnerable. To the south, Soviet armies would eventually move toward Belgorod and Kharkov. The defense and the counteroffensive were connected. This is what made Kursk so dangerous for the German command. Citadel was not occurring in isolation. While German planners concentrated elite formations against the salient, the Red Army prepared to attack elsewhere. A successful German breakthrough, therefore, needed to happen quickly. There was no unlimited reserve of time. Inside the German assembly areas, soldiers could see only fragments of this preparation. Reconnaissance photographs showed trench lines. Patrols reported mines. Prisoners described units. Intelligence officers marked suspected reserves on maps. But no single report could convey the total weight of the system. The real measure came only when the attack began. A company moved forward and stopped at mines. An engineer platoon cleared a lane. A Soviet gun opened fire. German artillery answered. A tank burned. Another moved around it. Infantry entered a trench. Then someone looked beyond the captured position and saw more earthworks in the distance. The battle had only begun. The construction of the Soviet defensive system also represented an immense human effort. Trenches do not appear by themselves. Men and women dig them. Engineers survey fields. Soldiers carry timber. Civilians are mobilized for labor. Wire must be transported. Mines must be moved safely and then buried. Gun positions require camouflage. Telephone cable must be laid and repaired. Routes through the rear area must be marked. Bridges must be strengthened. Alternative command posts must be prepared. The Kursk defenses were therefore not simply a military idea. They were weeks of physical labor. For German reconnaissance aircraft, the visible result was earthworks. What could not easily be photographed was familiarity. Soviet soldiers living in prepared positions learned the ground. They knew which shallow valley could hide a tank, which track became dusty in dry weather, which village roof could be used as an artillery reference point, which trench led to the reserve company, which anti-tank gun covered the road. This familiarity gave defenders another advantage. The attacker entered unfamiliar terrain under fire. The defender had already walked it. The Soviet command also prepared dummy positions and camouflage. Not every trench shown by aerial reconnaissance contained troops. Not every gun position was real. Conversely, some real positions were difficult to identify. The German artillery preparation therefore faced the same problem as every bombardment against a deep defense. It could destroy known targets. It could suppress areas. It could shake defenders. But it could not guarantee that every weapon ahead of the assault had been found. Once the barrage lifted, surviving Soviet soldiers emerged from dugouts. Machine guns were remanned. Observers returned to positions. Anti-tank crews waited for the first vehicles. The defender did not need to survive untouched. He needed to survive enough. The night before a major offensive has a peculiar stillness. It is not truly quiet. Vehicles move. Engines start and stop. Artillery crews prepare ammunition. Messengers arrive. Radios carry short transmissions. Officers walk between command posts. In the darkness, metal sounds louder. A dropped tool can seem to echo. The men know that hundreds of thousands of others are making similar preparations across the front. Yet each soldier experiences only his own small space. A tanker checks fuel. An infantryman adjusts equipment straps. A machine gun crew divides ammunition. An engineer examines a mine detector. A medic sorts bandages. A driver studies the road ahead by the light of a covered lamp. Rumors travel quickly. The Soviets know. The Soviets do not know. The attack has been delayed again. No, it begins before dawn. The artillery will open at one time. No, the schedule changed. Such uncertainty is normal in war. At Kursk it carried extra weight because Citadel had been discussed for so long. Some German soldiers had spent weeks in the region. They had watched Soviet positions become more visible. They had seen new wire. They had heard artillery registration. They knew that surprise was gone. That did not mean morale was absent. Many units remained confident. German armored formations had defeated Soviet armies repeatedly. The counteroffensive around Kharkov in March was recent memory. Experienced crews trusted their weapons and their training. The Luftwaffe was expected to provide strong support. Artillery preparations had been studied carefully. The new tanks inspired curiosity and hope. But confidence existed beside unease. The men could see the scale of the preparation. The greater the preparation, the greater the implied resistance. At some headquarters, maps were covered in lines and symbols. Minefields, artillery positions, objectives, boundaries between units, routes for reserves, phase lines. In theory, the movement could be described precisely. In practice, every plan would begin to age the moment the first units crossed the line of departure. The Soviet command had also prepared for the night. Intelligence suggested the attack was imminent. Soviet artillery opened a preemptive bombardment in some sectors before the German main assault. Its tactical effect has sometimes been exaggerated. It did not cripple Citadel. But for German soldiers waiting in assembly areas, shells arriving before their own offensive could begin carried a clear message. The enemy was not asleep. At around the same time, German artillery prepared its own fires. The horizon flashed. The sound rolled over fields. For men inside tanks, artillery was experienced partly through vibration. Hatches might be open at first, then closed. Voices came through intercoms. Engines grew louder. Dust entered everything. The first vehicles began moving. A tank column at night or before dawn is not a clean line. Drivers struggle to maintain spacing. Red tail lamps disappear in dust. Vehicles stop unexpectedly. Orders are repeated. A breakdown can force those behind to move around. If engineers are clearing lanes through mines, the entire formation may depend on markers that are difficult to see. The German attack needed momentum from the beginning. Instead, parts of the front immediately became congested. The northern assault under Model encountered fierce resistance and dense obstacles. The southern attack achieved more movement, but it too faced mines and defensive positions from the first hours. For infantry, the approach to Soviet trenches was often the most dangerous part. Artillery might suppress a position without destroying it. Machine guns survived in dugouts. Anti-tank guns waited. Once German infantry entered a trench system, combat became close and confusing. A trench was not a straight line. It bent. It connected to dugouts. Communication trenches led backward. A position that appeared captured could still contain defenders in another section. Armored vehicles supported the infantry where terrain and mines allowed. But armor and infantry could become separated. A tank might push forward because the ground ahead looked clear, while soldiers beside it were pinned. Or infantry might advance into terrain where tanks could not follow. Coordination, always important, became essential. The German army had long emphasized combined arms. At Kursk, the battlefield constantly tested whether that cooperation could survive friction. Engineers needed infantry protection. Infantry needed artillery. Tanks needed engineers. Artillery observers needed communications. Aircraft needed identification of friendly positions. Recovery crews needed access to damaged vehicles. The whole system had to move together. The Soviet defensive system was designed to make that coordination break apart. As dawn spread across the front on July 5th, the battle became visible. Smoke lay over fields. Columns of vehicles moved along tracks. Aircraft crossed above. Burning vehicles marked minefields and firing positions. Villages that had been quiet the day before became names in situation reports. The men who had waited for Citadel no longer had to wonder when it would begin. Now the question was whether it could continue. The northern pincer of Operation Citadel belonged to 9th Army. Its commander, Walter Model, faced a difficult task. He had to drive south through some of the strongest Soviet defenses in the salient, break the tactical zones, and create enough space for mobile forces to exploit toward Kursk. The attack began with substantial force. But force alone did not guarantee depth. The terrain north of Kursk favored defense in several areas. Villages, ridgelines, rail embankments, and prepared positions created repeated obstacles. The Soviet Central Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky had concentrated artillery and anti-tank defenses along likely routes. The German advance, therefore, developed differently from the dramatic armored breakthroughs of earlier campaigns. Progress was measured in kilometers, sometimes less. One of the best-known points of fighting was Ponyri. The village and railway station sat in a sector of great tactical importance. German attacks and Soviet counterattacks turned the area into a dense battlefield of infantry, artillery, armor, and ruined buildings. Later accounts sometimes called Ponyri the Stalingrad of Kursk. The comparison can be overused. The scale and nature of the two battles were different. But the phrase captures one aspect of the fighting. A German offensive designed for movement became fixed around positions that had to be attacked repeatedly. Each local battle absorbed troops. A hill, a railway line, a village edge, a trench network, a gun position. On a staff map, these were tiny. In the life of an infantry regiment, they could become the entire world. Model's forces included heavy armor and Ferdinand tank destroyers. The Ferdinands could be devastating against Soviet tanks and guns when they engaged at long range. Their frontal armor made them difficult to destroy from the front with many weapons. but the northern battlefield exposed their weaknesses. Mines damaged vehicles. Close terrain reduced standoff distance. Infantry threats mattered. Recovery was difficult. A heavy vehicle immobilized under fire could become useless even if its armor had not been penetrated. The German infantry also paid heavily. When armor was slowed, Soviet artillery could strike the supporting troops. Machine guns and mortars covered approaches. The German army had excellent tactical experience, but no amount of experience removed the basic problem. The defense had depth. Breaking the first line did not open the road. The offensive continued. German units gained ground. Soviet positions were taken. Prisoners were captured. Tanks and guns were destroyed. But the northern pincer failed to create the operational breakthrough required by Citadel. This distinction matters. A battlefield can contain many German tactical successes, while the operation as a whole fails. If a division captures a position, but advances only a few kilometers, that may not help a plan that requires two distant pincers to meet. If Soviet reserves can contain the penetration, then the cost of the advance becomes more important than the ground gained. Konstantin Rokossovsky committed reserves where needed. Artillery concentrations shifted. Counterattacks kept pressure on German units. The Soviets suffered heavy losses in places, but their defensive structure remained intact enough to prevent the kind of collapse Germany required. For German troops in the north, the experience was one of repeated effort. Attack. Pause. Clear mines. Attack again. Repair vehicles. Bring ammunition forward. Respond to counterattack. Reorganize. Attack another position. Each cycle consumed daylight and strength. The Germans had planned a pincer. The northern force was becoming trapped in a battle of reduction. This created a strategic problem for the southern pincer, even before the men there fully understood it. The plan depended on convergence. If Model could not break through from the north, then Hof's forces in the south would have to advance farther and face more of the burden alone. The geometry of the operation was changing. The northern pincer had not been destroyed. It remained powerful. But by the first days of Citadel, the prospect of a rapid breakthrough was fading. The Soviet defense had accomplished its first task. It had slowed the attacker. And once time began working against Germany, every additional day mattered. The northern attack also suffered from the way battlefield geometry narrowed German choices. Once the main effort became committed along certain routes, shifting the weight of the offensive was difficult. Artillery had registered targets. Engineers had cleared lanes. Supply dumps had been positioned. Bridges had been prepared. Changing the axis of an entire army was not like turning an arrow on a map. It required moving thousands of vehicles and guns across roads already crowded with traffic. The Soviets could therefore reinforce threatened areas with increasing confidence once the main German thrust was clear. This was one of the hidden advantages created by the loss of surprise. Before the battle, Soviet commanders had to consider several possible routes. After the first day, German actions revealed priorities. After the second, the picture became clearer. Reserves could move toward the danger. Artillery could shift. Minefields could be strengthened. German commanders still achieved local surprise at times, but the operational direction was no longer mysterious. For Model, this meant every hour of delay made the next hour harder. The attack had to create a cascading failure in the Soviet defense. Instead, the opposite occurred. The longer Ninth Army remained in front of the same general defensive region, the more completely the Red Army understood where to concentrate against it. This did not reduce the courage or skill of the German troops. It changed the mathematics of the fight. A breakthrough force that cannot move becomes a target for concentration. And concentration was something the Red Army was learning to do very well. South of Kursk, the offensive developed with greater momentum. 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth attacked northward from the Belgorod region. The southern force included some of the strongest armored formations available to Germany. Among them was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with Leibstandarte, SS, Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. The presence of these formations gave the southern attack considerable striking power. It also gave later memory of Kursk a strong focus on the south. Here, German armor advanced farther than in Model's sector. Here, the road toward Oboyan and Prokhorovka would produce the most famous armored fighting of the operation. And here, for several days, it remained possible to imagine that Citadel might still achieve something significant. The southern attack faced the Soviet Voronezh front under Nikolai Vatutin. Its defenses were deep, but terrain and the concentration of German mobile forces allowed Hoth to make more progress. The opening stages were still difficult. Minefields slowed vehicles. Soviet anti-tank guns fought from prepared positions. Infantry had to clear trenches and villages. Artillery and air support were called forward repeatedly. The difference was that German armored spearheads in the south managed to penetrate farther before Soviet reserves could fully stabilize the situation. This did not mean the advance resembled a free-moving blitzkrieg. It was still a fight through defenses. The German attack often depended on creating narrow penetrations and then pushing armored units through them. Those narrow routes produce congestion. A battalion moving through a cleared lane might find destroyed vehicles ahead. Support columns became compressed. Artillery had to relocate. Fuel trucks had to follow. The farther the spearhead moved, the more fragile its connection to the rear became. The Soviets responded with counterattacks. Some were poorly coordinated and costly. German anti-tank guns and armored vehicles could destroy attacking Soviet tanks at range. The Tiger, used from favorable positions, was especially dangerous. German crews often had better optics and communications than their Soviet counterparts. But every Soviet counterattack forced a response. A German unit preparing to move forward might have to stop and fight. An artillery battalion might shift fire. A tank company might turn away from its planned route. The defenders did not always need to win tactically to consume German time. The southern advance also created uncertainty for both headquarters. How deep was the penetration? Which Soviet reserve formations had arrived? Could the Germans still reach open ground? Would the Soviets commit their larger armored reserves too early? Could the flanks of the German spearheads remain secure? These questions became more urgent as the operation continued. The German attack was strongest at the tip. Behind the leading armored formations stretched a corridor. That corridor had to be protected. If Soviet forces struck the shoulders of the penetration, the spearhead could be isolated. German infantry formations therefore had to widen and secure the route while armored units pushed ahead. This reduced the number of forces available for the decisive thrust. Army Detachment Kempf attacked on the eastern side of the southern operation. Its progress was important because it was supposed to protect the flank and contribute to the northward advance. But coordination across separate corps and difficult terrain was never simple. The Soviet defense forced the Germans to solve several problems at once. Push north. Protect the east flank. Keep supply routes open. Repair armor. Defeat counterattacks. Maintain air support. And do all of this while the northern pincer was already slowing. For men in the leading formations, however, the strategic situation remained distant. They saw the next ridge, the next village, the next minefield. Tank crews watched for muzzle flashes. Infantry scanned tree lines. Officers listened to radios. Dust covered uniforms and equipment. Summer heat built inside armored vehicles. The air could smell of exhaust, hot oil, dry earth, and smoke. The battle moved forward, but never cleanly. The deeper the southern pincer advanced, the closer it came to the Soviet operational reserves. And among the names waiting ahead was one that would later become almost inseparable from Kursk: Prokhorovka. But before the Germans reached it, they still had to cross a landscape designed to wear them down. The southern advance produced a different but related problem. Success created longer flanks. Every kilometer north stretched the corridor behind the armored spearhead. That corridor had to remain open for fuel, ammunition, wounded evacuation, recovery vehicles, and command traffic. A map might show a clean wedge. On the ground, the wedge contained hundreds of small dependencies. A bridge over a stream, a road junction, a captured village, a slope overlooking a supply route. If any of these points fell under Soviet artillery or counterattack, traffic slowed. German infantry divisions therefore spent much of their strength securing the sides of the penetration while the armored formations tried to keep moving. This was the cost of depth. A spearhead cannot exist without a shaft behind it. The Soviet command repeatedly attacked that shaft. Some counterattacks were destroyed. Others gained little ground. But they forced the Germans to leave units behind. A tank battalion detached to protect a flank was unavailable at the tip, An artillery regiment firing backward was not supporting the next assault north. A reconnaissance battalion watching a threatened road was not scouting ahead. The operational effect accumulated. The farther the Germans advanced, the more of their strength became tied to what they had already captured. This was another reason the southern penetration never turned into true freedom of movement. The Germans had entered the Soviet defensive system. They had not escaped it. Minefields shaped the rhythm of Kursk. They shaped the routes. They shaped the speed. They shaped the relationship between armor and infantry. They even shaped the memory of the battle, because many damaged tanks later photographed on the field had not been destroyed in dramatic tank duels at all. Some had been disabled by mines. For an armored formation, a minefield creates a dilemma. To move quickly is dangerous. To move slowly is also dangerous. A tank moving carefully gives enemy gunners more time. A tank waiting for engineers becomes a stationary target. A column packed into a narrow, cleared lane creates congestion. The best solution is usually combined. Reconnaissance identifies the obstacle. Engineers open several lanes. Artillery suppresses enemy guns. Smoke may conceal movement. Infantry protects the engineers. Armor then passes through quickly. This sounds orderly. Under fire, it becomes far less so. A mine detector can miss a mine. A marker can be destroyed. Dust can hide a safe route. A tank can drift outside the cleared lane. A mine explosion can block the path. Artillery can kill engineers. A Soviet gun can force tanks to maneuver exactly where mines are waiting. The battlefield becomes a contest between the attacker's ability to restore movement and the defender's ability to interrupt it. German engineers at Kursk performed dangerous work. They moved ahead of armor. They probed ground. They used explosive charges. They marked lanes. Some worked at night. Others worked in daylight under direct fire. Their success often determined whether the tanks behind them could fight at all. The Soviet side understood this. Engineers were valuable targets. Artillery fire on mine-clearing parties could delay an entire formation. Machine guns covered obstacles. Anti-tank guns waited for vehicles emerging from lanes. In the south, where German armor advanced farther, minefields did not stop every thrust. But they reduced speed. That reduction mattered because German success depended on reaching deeper positions before Soviet reserves could fully deploy. A few hours lost at one minefield might allow a tank corps to move into place. A morning spent clearing another obstacle might allow artillery to register new targets. A damaged bridge could delay fuel. War at this level is often decided through accumulation. No single delay appears decisive. Together they change the operation. The new Panther tanks were particularly vulnerable to this environment because mechanical failures and mine damage combined. A Panther that suffered an engine problem did not need enemy fire to leave the advance. A Panther that hit a mine might require a heavy recovery vehicle. The number of tanks theoretically assigned to a unit could therefore be very different from the number actually available for combat at a given hour. This is one reason simple tank counts can mislead. A formation might possess 100 tanks on paper. Some were under repair. Some were recovering other vehicles. Some were short of fuel. Some were separated from the main body. Some were operational, but not in the right place. Combat strength was fluid. The same was true for Soviet formations. Tank corps could arrive after long road marches with mechanical losses. Crews could be exhausted. Units could be committed piecemeal. Vehicles might enter battle without adequate reconnaissance. Kursk was not a perfectly organized confrontation between complete formations. It was a constantly changing field of partial strengths. For German soldiers moving through the mine belts, the scale of the Soviet preparation became more obvious each day. A captured position revealed another. Fields contained marked and unmarked mines. Villages had been prepared for defense. Gun pits were dug into slopes. Telephone wire connected positions. Supply trenches ran backward. This was not improvised resistance. The salient had been prepared deliberately. The German attack continued because operational plans do not vanish the moment they become difficult. Orders remained. Objectives remained. Commanders still believed opportunities might appear. The southern pincer still had strength. The Luftwaffe still provided powerful support. German units were still inflicting heavy losses. But the relationship between effort and distance was worsening. More fuel. More ammunition. More damaged vehicles. More casualties. For each kilometer. The minefields had done more than damage tanks. They had forced the German offensive to fight at the pace chosen by the defense. And once that happened, the entire purpose of Citadel began to erode. The air battle above Kursk deserves its own place in the story, because the ground forces did not fight under an empty sky. German air power had been one of the foundations of earlier mobile victories. In 1941, Luftwaffe attacks disrupted Soviet headquarters, transport, airfields, and reserves. German ground commanders grew accustomed to calling on aircraft to strike concentrations ahead of an advance. By 1943, the situation had changed. The Luftwaffe could still concentrate powerful forces over a chosen sector. Experienced pilots remained. Ground attack aircraft could devastate tanks, artillery positions, and columns caught in the open. Stuka units continued to deliver accurate attacks where air defenses and enemy fighters allowed. But Soviet aviation had grown in size, experience, and organization. The skies over Kursk became contested. German pilots no longer operated with the same confidence that had characterized the first summer of the invasion. For men on the ground, the distinction between air superiority and contested airspace was immediate. When friendly aircraft dominated, roads behind the front felt safer. Supply columns moved more freely. Artillery batteries worried less about sudden attack. Reconnaissance aircraft could observe the enemy. When enemy fighters and ground attack aircraft appeared, movement changed. Vehicles dispersed. Camouflage became more important. Columns waited for darkness. Anti-aircraft guns moved closer to important routes. A road that had been efficient became dangerous. The air war also influenced the speed of command. Aerial reconnaissance provided information about Soviet movements. Photographs revealed defensive lines. Observers tried to identify tank concentrations. But reconnaissance only helps if the information arrives in time. A Soviet reserve photographed in the morning might have moved by afternoon. A German headquarters acting on old imagery could strike an empty field. The Soviets faced the same problem. Aircraft became another part of the information battle. The fighting over Kursk was costly for both air forces. The exact numbers claimed by wartime propaganda should be treated carefully because pilots often overclaimed victories in the confusion of combat. What matters for the larger story is that German air support remained strong, but no longer guaranteed freedom. The Red Army could move reserves under a sky where its own aircraft fought for access. This reduced one of the advantages German mobile warfare had enjoyed earlier. And like the minefields, it consumed time. A convoy waiting for darkness is a convoy not moving now. A headquarters forced to relocate after air attack loses hours. A damaged bridge delays fuel. A reconnaissance aircraft shot down does not deliver its photographs. The battlefield above the salient, therefore, reflected the same strategic change visible on the ground. Germany could still be dangerous. It could no longer assume dominance. Behind the armored spearheads lived another Kursk that is rarely shown. It was a world of tired men working around machines. Tank mechanics slept beside toolboxes. Fuel handlers filled drums. Cooks tried to prepare meals while units moved. Medical stations received wounded from several formations at once. Radio repairmen searched for broken connections. Military police directed traffic through road junctions. Clerks updated strength reports that became inaccurate almost immediately. The great battle depended on all of them. A tank crew might become famous for destroying enemy armor. But that crew could not fight if the ammunition truck failed to arrive. A battalion commander could plan a brilliant maneuver. It meant little if the bridge behind him collapsed under a heavy vehicle. The farther the attack moved, the more difficult these ordinary tasks became. Dust was constant. Fine soil entered engines and filters. It covered maps. It settled in food. It irritated eyes. The summer heat made armored vehicles exhausting places to work. Inside a tank, temperatures rose. Crews drank whenever water was available. Noise made conversation difficult. After hours of movement, even men who had not been under direct fire could be drained. Sleep became fragmented. A crew might repair a track late into the night and receive orders to move before dawn. An infantryman might spend the day attacking, the evening digging, and the night listening for a counterattack. Artillery crews handled heavy ammunition repeatedly. Engineers worked in front of everyone else and often rested last. This human fatigue is easy to remove from maps. Arrows do not become tired. Men do. The quality of a military system can often be measured by how well it manages exhaustion. Can crews rotate? Can damaged units pause? Can food reach the front? Can wounded men move backward quickly? Can mechanics keep pace? At Kursk, German formations entered the offensive after years of war. Many veterans had already fought through several campaigns. Their experience was valuable. It also meant they carried accumulated fatigue. The Red Army was exhausted too. Its soldiers had suffered retreat, winter, siege, and enormous casualties. But the Soviet defensive system at Kursk offered one important advantage. Many units were fighting from prepared positions. They had dug shelters. They knew the terrain. Supplies had been moved forward before the attack. The Germans had to bring their whole system with them as they advanced. That difference grew with every kilometer. The spearhead became farther from its workshops, farther from fuel dumps, farther from field hospitals, farther from the familiar roads of the assembly area. The defender, pushed backward, lost positions. But behind those positions waited more prepared ground. This is another reason the battle cannot be understood through tank counts alone. War is not only the collision of weapons. It is the endurance of organizations made from human beings. By the second week of Citadel, exhaustion had become another invisible force pressing against the German offensive. The machines of Kursk have become almost characters in the story. Their names carry weight even now. Tiger, Panther, Ferdinand, T-34, Su-152. They appear in photographs, museum halls, technical drawings, and arguments about armor thickness and gun penetration. But on the battlefield, no crew experienced a tank as a table of specifications. They experienced heat, noise, restricted vision, dust, mechanical vibration, a cramped compartment, radio traffic, the smell of fuel and oil, the sudden violence of a shell strike. A tank was a fighting vehicle, but also a workplace in which several men depended completely on one another. The German Tiger had already impressed both its crews and its enemies before Kursk. Its thick armor and powerful gun allowed it to engage many Soviet tanks at long range. In open terrain, a well-positioned Tiger could destroy targets before they were able to answer effectively. That advantage was real. It was also conditional. Long-range fire required visibility. Visibility required terrain. Terrain could be hidden by smoke, dust, crops, folds in the ground, or burning vehicles. A Tiger that had to cross a minefield became just as dependent on engineers as a lighter tank. A Tiger with damaged running gear could become a recovery problem weighing more than 50 tons. The Panther was intended to combine some of the best features German designers had recognized in Soviet tank design with German optics and firepower. Its sloped frontal armor and long gun gave it formidable potential. In later service, improved Panthers became dangerous opponents. At Kursk, the vehicle was not ready for the responsibility placed upon it. The first Panther units entered combat with serious mechanical weaknesses. Breakdowns reduced strength before combat. Some engines caught fire. Transmission and final drive failures appeared. Crews and maintenance personnel were still learning the vehicle. The result was a contradiction. A Panther that reached a good firing position could be extremely effective. A Panther immobilized by mechanical failure contributed nothing to the advance. When people later compare numbers of tanks at Kursk, this distinction matters. The German force did not enter each morning with every vehicle listed on its organizational chart. Operational strength changed constantly. Mechanics worked through the night to return vehicles to service. A tank damaged on one day might fight again 2 days later. Another might be abandoned because recovery was impossible. The Ferdinand had perhaps the most extreme combination of strengths and weaknesses. Its 88mm gun was one of the most powerful anti-tank weapons on the battlefield. Its frontal armor was immense. At range, Soviet tanks could struggle to harm it. But the vehicle was heavy. It lacked a conventional turret. The original version had no whole machine gun. In close terrain, surrounded by infantry, mines, and artillery, these limitations mattered. Some later stories claimed Soviet infantry easily destroyed large numbers of Ferdinands at close range. The reality was more complicated. Many were damaged by mines or artillery. Some suffered mechanical problems, and others were lost when they could not be recovered during changing battlefield conditions. The vehicle was not useless. It was highly effective in the role for which its gun and armor were suited. The problem was that Kursk did not allow specialized weapons to choose only favorable situations. The Soviet T-34 was different. It was not a rare heavy machine. It was a mass-produced medium tank that formed the backbone of Soviet armored strength. Its mobility and sloped armor had shocked German troops in 1941. By 1943, German weapons had improved. The 76mm gun of the T-34 increasingly struggled against the frontal armor of Tigers and Panthers at long range. This forced Soviet crews to use movement numbers, terrain, and closer engagement ranges. That could be costly. German crews often benefited from better optics and radios. German anti-tank guns could create deadly zones. But the Red Army could replace armor at a scale Germany increasingly found difficult to match. This did not mean Soviet tank losses were unimportant. They were enormous in some engagements. It meant the strategic consequences were different. Germany needed Citadel to produce a decisive operational result. The Soviets could absorb costly defensive actions if they still prevented the breakthrough and preserved enough strength for counteroffensives. Machines, therefore, had to be understood within strategy. A Tiger destroyed 5 tanks. An impressive tactical result. But if the German formation advanced only 1 kilometer and the Soviet front remained intact, the operational result might still favor the defender. A Soviet tank brigade lost heavily in a counterattack. A painful tactical defeat. But if the attack forced a German panzer regiment to stop for half a day, the broader purpose of the counterattack might still be partly achieved. This is one reason Kursk resists simple stories. The battlefield was full of events that could be called victories from one angle and failures from another. The German crews knew none of this in abstract terms. They knew whether their engines started, whether the gun fired, whether the radio worked, whether the commander could see, whether the next ridge was clear. A tank battle is often imagined as a duel. In reality, most crews feared more than tanks: mines, anti-tank guns, artillery, aircraft, infantry with explosives, mechanical breakdown, fuel shortage, recovery failure. A machine could survive enemy fire and still be lost to the operation. By the middle days of Citadel, the German armored formations were still dangerous. But their strength was being converted into damaged vehicles, exhausted crews, and hours spent repairing, reorganizing, and waiting. The famous machines continued to fight. The operation around them was running out of time. For the southern pincer, one of the important directions pointed toward Oboyan. The road north represented more than a town on the map. It represented access toward the interior of the salient. If German armored forces could continue advancing, they might create enough depth to force the Soviet command into increasingly desperate commitments. The southern attack had already penetrated farther than the northern one. This made the area feel like the place where Citadel might still be rescued. German headquarters watched the progress closely. So did Soviet headquarters. The more successful the German thrust became, the more reserves were directed toward it. The road was not open. Soviet defensive belts continued to absorb attacks. Strong points had to be reduced. Counterattacks struck flanks. Artillery slowed movement. The Germans often found that the direct route toward an objective was too strongly defended, requiring shifts in direction. Those shifts affected coordination. A corps moving northeast instead of north changed its relationship to neighboring formations. A division forced to turn created gaps or overlaps. Supply routes had to adjust. The battlefield was dynamic. One of the strengths of German armored command was the ability of experienced officers to improvise inside such conditions. Local commanders often reacted quickly. They shifted units, used artillery, concentrated tanks, exploited temporary weaknesses. This tactical flexibility allowed the southern attack to keep moving when a more rigid force might have stopped. But tactical flexibility could not change the strategic framework. The Soviets had reserves. The northern pincer was not approaching from the other direction. And the longer the southern attack continued alone, the farther it moved from the original concept of a coordinated double envelopment. The German advance was increasingly becoming a single deep thrust into a defense that still had operational depth. The route toward Oboyan illustrates the problem. The Germans could see the city as an objective. The Soviets could see the same route as the obvious direction to block. Anti-tank positions were reinforced. Tank formations were moved. Artillery zones were established. The closer the German spearhead came, the denser the reaction became. The southern battlefield also became crowded with formations. German armor, German infantry, Soviet rifle units, Soviet tank corps, artillery, engineers, supply columns, air units operating overhead. The amount of firepower concentrated into relatively small areas created enormous confusion. A commander might know the position of his own battalions at 1 hour and discover that the situation had changed by the next. Radio reports arrived late. Units became mixed. Maps were imperfect. Smoke hid landmarks. Dust reduced visibility. A village that served as a reference point in an order might already be burning. The Soviet command faced its own uncertainty. Where should the next reserve be committed? Was the German attack about to break northward? Would the main thrust turn toward Prokhorovka? Should tanks counterattack immediately or wait? No headquarters possessed perfect information. This is important when judging decisions after the fact. From a modern map, the battle can look frozen. Arrows show where units moved. Colored lines show positions. Symbols show reserves. The people making decisions did not see the completed map. They saw fragments, reports, rumors, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner statements, radio intercepts, staff estimates, some accurate, some outdated, some wrong. The German southern advance created real danger. The Soviets responded aggressively because they could not assume it would stop on its own. This led to costly counterattacks. German anti-tank defenses destroyed many Soviet vehicles. The image of Soviet tanks simply overwhelming German forces with numbers is misleading. Soviet armored attacks could be poorly coordinated and suffer heavily. But again, the strategic context mattered. The Red Army was using depth and reserves to keep the Germans from converting penetration into freedom of movement. Every German success brought the spearhead into contact with another force. The road north never became empty. For the tank crews, the fighting became a sequence of short advances and violent engagements. A ridge, a farm, a village, a line of guns, a counterattack, then a pause. Fuel, ammunition, repairs, orders, move again. The southern force was advancing. Yet the word advancing can hide how little of that movement resembled the operational freedom Germany needed. The road toward Oboyan remained ahead, and another road toward Prokhorovka was becoming more important. Few names are more closely associated with Kursk than Prokhorovka. For decades, Popular accounts described the fighting there as the greatest tank battle in history. Hundreds of tanks were said to have charged directly into one another at close range. The field became a symbol of Soviet courage and the moment when German armored power was finally broken. The real battle was dramatic enough without the legend. But it was not as simple as the legend. By July 12th, the southern German advance had created a dangerous penetration. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had pushed toward the Prokhorovka area. The Soviet command committed major armored reserves, including 5th Guards Tank Army, to counterattack. The resulting fighting was intense, confused, and costly. But the numbers and circumstances are debated. The German corps did not field an endless mass of Tigers. Most of its tanks were more ordinary panzer types and assault guns. The Soviet attack was not a perfectly coordinated wave. Terrain-constrained movement. A railway embankment, anti-tank ditch, villages, and broken ground affected routes. Some Soviet formations entered combat in cramped conditions. German anti-tank fire caused severe losses. The battle did not resemble two equal armored walls colliding across an empty plain. For German crews, the approach of Soviet tanks was still a terrifying sight. Dust clouds appeared. Engines grew louder. Targets emerged quickly. At close range, the advantages of long-range German guns became less important. Commanders had little time. Gunners traversed. Drivers maneuvered. Smoke and dust reduced visibility. Soviet tanks attempted to close the distance. German tanks and assault guns fired. Anti-tank guns joined. Artillery struck assembly areas. Aircraft operated overhead where conditions allowed. The battlefield became fragmented. One group might fight at long range. Another might encounter tanks at close range. A third might be delayed by terrain. This fragmentation helps explain why later memories differ. Each crew saw only a small part. A tank commander who fought 3 Soviet vehicles at a few hundred meters could honestly remember a close-range tank battle. Another crew a kilometer away might spend most of the engagement firing from a stationary position. A Soviet tanker might remember charging through dust toward German armor. A German officer might remember the same event as a defensive engagement against a poorly coordinated attack. Both could be describing parts of the same day. The Soviet losses around Prokhorovka were heavy. That fact once created difficulty for narratives that treated the battle as a simple Soviet tactical victory. Modern scholarship has examined the records more critically. The German formations were not annihilated on the field. Many damaged vehicles were recoverable because the Germans still controlled parts of the battlefield. The Soviet armored attack failed to destroy the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. And yet the larger German operation did not succeed. This is the paradox of Prokhorovka. A German force could inflict heavier tactical losses and still fail to achieve the strategic purpose for which Citadel had been launched. The southern pincer did not break through to freedom. The northern pincer remained stalled. Soviet reserves continued to appear. German strength was being consumed. Elsewhere, events were beginning that would force German attention away from the offensive. Prokhorovka therefore matters not because one dramatic tank charge single-handedly decided Kursk. It matters because it represents the point at which the southern German offensive had reached deep into the Soviet defensive system without achieving the operational breakthrough it needed. The Germans still possessed combat power. They could still attack. They could still destroy Soviet tanks. But the possibility of closing the Kursk salient was disappearing. For soldiers on the field, there was no clear moment when everyone understood this. Battles rarely announce their historical meaning. A tank crew might finish the day believing it had fought successfully. A Soviet unit might count terrible losses. A German headquarters might still consider another attack. The transformation from offensive to failure occurred gradually. Prokhorovka became famous because it offered a dramatic image. But Citadel was not defeated by one image. It was defeated by accumulation, mines, depth, reserves, delays, losses, the failure of the northern pincer, the expenditure of the southern spearhead, and Soviet offensives beginning beyond the salient. When the guns quieted around Prokhorovka, the German army had not been destroyed, but the offensive for which it had gathered its strength was nearing its end. The memory of Prokhorovka became especially powerful after the war, because both sides had reasons to emphasize different parts of the story. Soviet accounts could present the battle as the dramatic destruction of the German armored spearhead. German veterans could point to the heavy Soviet tank losses and argue that their own formations had not been defeated tactically. Both memories contained pieces of truth. Neither alone explained the campaign. The important question is what the forces were trying to achieve. The Soviet armored counterattack was intended to stop or disrupt the German advance. It did so at terrible cost and with serious tactical problems. The German armored force intended to break through the remaining Soviet depth and restore operational movement. It did not. This is why arguments over the exact number of tanks destroyed on one field can become misleading. Numbers matter, but purpose matters too. A force can lose more vehicles and still accomplish the larger defensive goal. Another force can destroy more vehicles and still fail in the operation. Kursk is full of this uncomfortable duality. German crews often fought effectively. Soviet crews often suffered severe losses. The Soviet strategy still succeeded. Understanding all three statements at once produces a more accurate picture than choosing only the one that fits a heroic legend. While attention often turns south toward Prokhorovka, the fate of Citadel had already been shaped heavily in the north. Model's Ninth Army had failed to achieve the required breakthrough. This failure did not mean Ninth Army had been passive. German troops had fought intensely. Positions had changed hands. Soviet formations had suffered losses. Ferdinands and other armored vehicles had destroyed enemy tanks and guns. Infantry had seized trenches and villages, but the depth of advance remained limited. The distinction between tactical achievement and operational failure was becoming impossible to ignore. Citadel required the northern and southern forces to create converging threats. The northern attack instead became fixed against the Soviet Central Front. As days passed, German units in the north shifted increasingly toward holding gains and responding to Soviet activity. The energy of the offensive was fading. Then the strategic situation worsened. On July 12th, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov against the German Ural salient north of Kursk. This was not a local counterattack inside the defensive zone. It was a major offensive against the flank and rear of the German position around Ural. The timing was devastating for Citadel. German formations that might have supported the attack toward Kursk were now needed to defend territory farther north. The strategic initiative was visibly changing. Germany had concentrated forces to eliminate one Soviet salient. The Soviets were attacking a German salient at the same time. The German command could not treat these operations separately. Reserves were limited. Railways were limited. Armored formations could not be in two places at once. Every Soviet penetration toward Ural increased pressure to redirect forces. For Model, the problem was immediate. Ninth Army had been attacking south. Now it faced danger on a broader front. The offensive mission became less relevant than survival and defensive stabilization. This change is one of the clearest signs that Citadel had failed. An offensive intended to regain initiative was being overtaken by an enemy offensive. The German army still possessed tactical competence. It could organize defensive lines. It could counterattack. It could slow Soviet advances. But the strategic rhythm was no longer being set by German plans. The Red Army had prepared for this. The defensive battle at Kursk had been connected from the beginning to offensive intentions. Once the German armored strength was engaged and weakened, Soviet forces attacked the shoulders. This did not produce effortless Soviet victory. Operation Kutuzov became another costly battle. German defenders used terrain, anti-tank weapons, and mobile reserves effectively. Soviet formations suffered. But the direction of pressure mattered. Germany was being forced backward. The Ural salient, once part of the northern base for Citadel, became a liability. To shorten the front and avoid greater danger, German forces would eventually withdraw. For the soldiers who had attacked days earlier, the change could feel abrupt. 1 week, orders pointed south. The next, formations prepared defensive positions or moved north. Vehicles damaged in the offensive now had to be repaired while the front shifted. Supply organizations reorganized. Roads filled with traffic moving in different directions. The great plan to encircle Kursk gave way to smaller questions. Which line can be held? Which bridge must be protected? Which damaged tanks can be recovered? Which units can be spared? How quickly can Soviet penetrations be contained? War had returned to the logic Germany hoped Citadel would prevent. Reaction. Defense. Withdrawal. The northern pincer had stopped. Soon, the entire offensive would stop with it. By the middle of July, Operation Citadel had become an operation without a realistic path to its original objective. The northern pincer was stalled. The southern pincer had penetrated deeply, but had not broken free. Soviet reserves remained active. Operation Kutuzov was attacking the Orel salient. Then another event entered German strategic calculations. On July 10th, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The Mediterranean and the Eastern Front were separated by thousands of kilometers, but Germany fought one war. For Hitler, the invasion of Sicily raised the danger that Italy might collapse and that German forces would be needed in the south. Later accounts often reduce the end of Citadel to a single meeting in which Hitler cancelled the offensive because of Sicily. The reality was more complicated. Citadel was already in serious trouble. The northern pincer had failed. The Soviet counteroffensive at Orel demanded attention. The southern force still had some offensive possibilities, and Manstein argued that further attacks might inflict additional losses. But the original operation, the encirclement of the Kursk salient, was no longer achievable. The question was no longer whether Citadel would succeed as planned. The question was how much longer German forces should continue attacking and what could still be gained. This matters because the failure of Kursk cannot be explained by one external event. Sicily influenced German decisions. It did not create the minefields. It did not stop Ninth Army. It did not produce Soviet defensive depth. It did not cause the southern pincer to exhaust itself. Those problems already existed. The German army had entered Citadel hoping to destroy Soviet reserves and restore initiative. Instead, the offensive had committed elite units to a battle the Red Army had anticipated. German forces inflicted heavy casualties. They destroyed large numbers of tanks and guns. Their tactical performance remained dangerous. Yet the exchange was occurring inside a strategic environment increasingly favorable to the Soviet Union. Germany could not replace losses as easily. It could not keep concentrating elite armor for offensives that gained limited ground. It could not force the Red Army into decisive encirclements the way it had in 1941. The Soviets had learned to trade space, depth, and reserves for time. At Kursk, that learning reached a new level. The German offensive did not collapse in a dramatic rout. There was no single day when the attacking armies disintegrated. Instead, Citadel lost purpose. Orders changed. Some attacks continued locally. Units repositioned. Armored formations prepared to move elsewhere. The front became defensive. The German side still hoped to hold much of its territory. But the Red Army was already preparing the next blows. This transition is less cinematic than a tank battle. It is also more important. Strategic initiative is difficult to photograph. It appears in planning cycles, in which side chooses where to concentrate, in which side moves reserves first, in whether an army attacks according to its own timetable or reacts to someone else's. Before Kursk, Germany still attempted to choose a major summer offensive on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the pattern changed. There would be local German counteroffensives. There would be dangerous defensive battles. German armored formations would remain capable of inflicting severe losses. But the era of large German summer campaigns designed to decide the war in the East was over. Citadel had been intended as a return to offensive mastery. It became evidence that the conditions that made earlier German victories possible were disappearing. The men on the ground did not need strategic theory to understand one fact. They had attacked. They had not reached Kursk. Now the Soviets were attacking. The arrows on the map were beginning to point west. When Operation Kutuzov began on July 12th, the meaning of the fighting around Kursk changed. The German High Command had entered July expecting to force the Red Army to react. Now German headquarters were reacting instead. The Soviet offensive struck the Ural salient from several directions. For months, that German-held bulge had served as the northern shoulder from which 9th Army attacked toward Kursk. Now it became a target. The Red Army had gathered strong forces for the task. Its objective was not merely to relieve pressure on the Kursk salient. The plan was to drive into the Ural position, force the Germans to abandon ground, and destroy or weaken the formations defending it. The Ural salient had advantages for Germany. It projected eastward and provided positions from which the Germans could threaten Soviet territory. But a salient also creates long flanks. Once the Red Army had sufficient strength, those flanks could be attacked. German commanders now confronted the same geometric problem they had hoped to impose on the Soviets at Kursk. The transition from attacker to defender happened quickly. Units that had been preparing to advance south were moved or reoriented. Armored reserves were demanded in threatened sectors. Railways and roads became crowded. Orders changed as reports arrived. Soviet penetrations had to be contained before they widened. The German army remained highly capable in defense. This should not be forgotten. A formation retreating or defending after a failed offensive does not instantly lose its tactical skill. German officers understood how to organize strong points, use anti-tank guns, shift reserves, and launch local counterattacks. The terrain around Ural could be used to slow Soviet forces. Villages became defensive positions. Ridges became firing lines. Artillery covered roads. Armored vehicles attacked Soviet spearheads when opportunities appeared. The Red Army paid heavily. Its offensives in 1943 were more sophisticated than those of earlier years, but they were not effortless. Coordination problems remained. Tank losses could be enormous. Infantry attacks sometimes continued against prepared positions at great cost. Supply lines stretched as forces advanced. German counterattacks could still disrupt Soviet plans. Yet the central problem for Germany was not whether every Soviet attack succeeded immediately. It was the scale and persistence of pressure. If one Soviet army was stopped, another sector might become active. If German armor was concentrated to counter one penetration, it was unavailable somewhere else. The Red Army possessed greater depth in manpower and material. This allowed Soviet commanders to keep generating operational problems faster than Germany could solve them permanently. At Orel, the German response became a fighting withdrawal. The decision to abandon the salient was not made lightly. Territory had political meaning. Railways had logistical value. Prepared positions represented labor and time. Hitler resisted retreat in many situations because he believed holding ground forced the enemy to spend strength. Sometimes that logic had tactical merit, but holding a vulnerable salient can also consume the defender. If the flanks collapse, troops inside may be trapped. The German command, therefore, began shortening the front. Withdrawal under pressure is one of the most difficult military operations. A unit cannot simply turn around and drive away. Some troops must remain behind to cover the movement. Bridges may need to be destroyed. Supplies must be evacuated or burned. Damaged vehicles must be repaired, towed, or abandoned. Artillery must move in stages so that some guns remain available to support the rear guard. Headquarters must maintain communications while changing location. Roads fill with military traffic and civilians. The enemy tries to accelerate the retreat. For soldiers who had expected Citadel to restore German initiative, the withdrawal from Orel was a harsh reversal. The offensive had not merely failed to eliminate the Soviet salient. The German salient in the north was disappearing instead. On the map, the front line began to move west. The Red Army's offensive pressure also had a psychological effect. German troops increasingly understood that there would be no long pause after Citadel. There would be no season in which the front simply stabilized while units recovered. The Soviet command intended to keep moving. This was a strategic method Germany found difficult to answer. Earlier in the war, German offensives had created enormous Soviet crises. Now Soviet offensives were creating overlapping German crises. One threatened Orel. Another would threaten Belgorod and Kharkov. Further operations would follow elsewhere. The Wehrmacht still possessed powerful divisions. But a division can only fight in one place at one time. Every emergency demanded transport, fuel, replacement crews, ammunition, command attention. The failure of Citadel, therefore, mattered beyond the ground south of Orel or north of Belgorod. Germany had concentrated some of its best mobile formations for a planned offensive. The Red Army had absorbed the blow, then launched its own offensives before Germany could recover. This was the rhythm that would define much of the remaining war in the east. For the men retreating from the Orel salient, strategy appeared as dust on the road. Columns moved west. Artillery fired from temporary positions. Rear guards waited until the last practical moment. Soviet aircraft appeared. Engines overheated. Disabled vehicles were dragged away. Villages that had been behind the front became part of the battlefield. The direction of travel had changed. And it would keep changing. The southern half of the battlefield did not become quiet when Citadel ended. The Red Army prepared another major offensive. Operation Rumyantsev began in early August. Its objectives included Belgorod and Kharkov, the same broad region where German forces had regained ground during Manstein's counteroffensive only months earlier. The cycle was striking. In March, German armored formations had retaken Kharkov and stabilized the southern front. In July, those forces had attacked north toward Kursk. By August, they were being forced back toward the ground from which Citadel had begun. For German troops, the strategic map was shrinking. The Red Army attack was powerful. Soviet commanders had learned from the defensive battle and continued to commit large formations. Artillery preparations struck German positions. Armored units pushed through penetrations. Infantry followed. Air power supported the advance. Again, Soviet losses could be high. Again, German counterattacks could be dangerous. But the operational balance favored the attacker. Belgorod fell. Kharkov became the center of another difficult battle. The city had already changed hands more than once during the war. Its railways and industrial importance made it valuable. Its symbolic value also grew with every battle. German forces attempted to slow the Soviet advance and preserve their own formations. Manstein continued to use mobile defense where circumstances allowed. Armored units counterattacked Soviet spearheads. The goal was often not to recover every kilometer permanently, but to disrupt the enemy, buy time, and allow threatened units to withdraw. This method could still produce local successes. A Soviet tank corps that advanced too far might find its flanks exposed. German Panthers and Tigers, used from good positions, could inflict heavy losses. Anti-tank guns remained effective. Experienced panzer commanders understood how to concentrate force quickly. Yet the strategic environment had changed since March. The Soviet reserves were deeper. The Red Army was less likely to collapse after one counterstroke. When one formation suffered losses, others continued the pressure. The Germans could win a local engagement and still be forced to withdraw the next day because neighboring sectors had failed. This became a recurring feature of the later Eastern Front. Tactical skill could delay defeat. It could not always reverse the operational trend. Kharkov was eventually abandoned by German forces. The Soviet recovery of the city confirmed what Citadel had failed to prevent. The Red Army was not exhausted. Its offensive capacity had not been destroyed. On the contrary, Soviet forces were now driving west across a broad front. For German planners, this created another difficult problem. Should armored reserves be held together for powerful counterattacks, or divided among threatened sectors? Concentration offered greater striking power. Dispersion provided more immediate support to infantry. There was no perfect answer. If panzer divisions were concentrated, a weak sector elsewhere might collapse. If they were dispersed, no single group might possess enough strength to produce a decisive counterstroke. The German army increasingly lived inside such compromises. Fuel shortages made movement expensive. Tank losses reduced unit strength. Experienced commanders and crews were lost. Replacement soldiers arrived with less training. Aircraft support became harder to guarantee as the Luftwaffe faced growing demands across several theaters. The Allies were fighting in Italy, bombing Germany, building strength in Britain. The Soviet Union was advancing in the east. Germany could still fight everywhere. It could no longer dominate everywhere. The battles around Belgorod and Kharkov, therefore, belonged to the same story as Kursk, even though they came after Citadel. They revealed the result. The German offensive had been intended to shorten the front and destroy Soviet strength. Instead, German forces were now withdrawing across a longer sequence of battlefields. The Red Army had turned defense into offense. And once the front began moving west, Germany faced a question that would become more urgent with every season. Where could the retreat finally stop? The phrase strategic initiative sounds abstract. It is easier to understand through a simple question. Who decides where the next major battle will be? In 1941, Germany usually answered that question. German armies crossed the frontier and chose axes toward Minsk, Smolensk, Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow. The Red Army reacted to disasters. In 1942, Germany again chose a major summer offensive, driving toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. The Soviets eventually seized the initiative through Operation Uranus, but the front remained fluid through the winter. In the spring of 1943, the German victory around Kharkov showed that the Wehrmacht could still create operational surprise and inflict severe defeats. Operation Citadel was meant to confirm that Germany remained capable of choosing the next major campaign. Instead, Kursk demonstrated the opposite. Germany chose the battlefield. The Soviet command prepared for it. Germany chose the date after several delays. The Soviet command used those delays. Germany concentrated elite formations. The Red Army built depth and reserves. Germany attacked. The Soviets absorbed the attack. Then the Red Army launched major offensives north and south. This did not mean every future German operation would be defensive. German forces would counterattack many times. They would launch local offensives. They would still create crises. At times, they would temporarily restore a front. But after Kursk, the broad pattern of the Eastern Front changed. The Red Army increasingly determined the sequence of campaigns. The Dnieper, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic, Poland, East Prussia, the Vistula, the Oder, Berlin. Those names belonged to the future. In July 1943, no soldier at Kursk could see the entire road. But the direction had been established. The German army's problem was not simply that Soviet numbers were greater. The deeper issue was that the Soviet military system had improved. The Red Army of 1943 was able to plan a strategic defense, absorb a major offensive, preserve reserves, and then conduct large counteroffensives. This required more than manpower. It required command, logistics, rail transport, engineering, artillery planning, air support, staff work, communications, industrial replacement. The Soviets still made serious mistakes. Their losses remained enormous. Some commanders used troops wastefully. Some attacks were poorly coordinated. But the institution had learned. Germany had learned too. Its soldiers and officers adapted constantly. Defensive tactics improved. Camouflage improved. Anti-tank methods improved. Armored units developed ways to counter Soviet penetrations. Yet Germany was adapting inside a worsening strategic balance. Its enemies were growing stronger faster. The Soviet Union was not fighting alone. American trucks, food, raw materials, locomotives, and other Lend-Lease supplies contributed to Soviet logistics. Britain and the United States were fighting Germany in the air and Mediterranean. Allied bombing forced Germany to divert fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The invasion of Sicily opened another front. The German war economy expanded production under tremendous pressure, but production could not solve every shortage. A tank without fuel was useless. A fighter without a trained pilot was limited. A division without experienced non-commissioned officers became weaker, even if its manpower total looked acceptable. Kursk accelerated these problems because Germany committed high-quality formations to an offensive that did not achieve its strategic objective. The battle also consumed something less measurable: confidence in the possibility of another decisive Eastern victory. After Stalingrad, Germany could still point to Kharkov. After Kursk, there was no comparable recovery. The front moved west. German propaganda continued to speak of defensive success and Soviet losses. Those claims were not entirely empty. The Red Army did suffer terribly. But the map mattered more. Orel was lost. Belgorod was lost. Kharkov was lost. The German line withdrew toward the Dnieper. Strategic initiative does not require every battle to be easy. It requires the ability to keep choosing the next problem for the enemy. After Kursk, that ability increasingly belonged to the Soviet Union. For a German soldier, this change might not appear as a grand realization. It might appear as new orders. Dig here. Move tonight. Destroy this bridge. Hold until morning. Then withdraw. Another defensive line. Another village. Another river. The war became a sequence of positions behind positions. The men who had once measured progress eastward began measuring distance to the west. For German soldiers later, in 1943, the change of initiative also appeared in the pace of replacement. Units that had once paused for rebuilding increasingly returned to combat before they felt ready. A panzer regiment might receive new tanks, but lack veteran crews. An infantry division might be restored numerically with younger replacements, while still missing experienced leaders. A battalion could look complete on a strength report and feel entirely different in combat. Experience is not distributed evenly. One veteran platoon leader can stabilize several frightened men. One skilled mechanic can keep vehicles operating that would otherwise be abandoned. One experienced radio operator can prevent confusion during movement. Losses at Kursk therefore mattered beyond the number killed or the number of tanks destroyed. They removed accumulated knowledge. The Soviet Union suffered the same human cost on an even larger scale. But its population, industrial base, and replacement system gave it greater ability to keep forming and rebuilding armies. By late 1943, Soviet formations also contained a growing core of officers and soldiers who had survived multiple campaigns. The learning process had become institutional. That was perhaps the deepest change since 1941. Germany was no longer fighting an opponent that had to relearn the same lessons after every defeat. It was fighting an opponent that increasingly stored those lessons in doctrine, staff procedures, engineering practice, artillery organization, and operational planning. Kursk was both a battle and an examination. The Red Army had spent 2 years studying. In July 1943, the examination was passed at enormous cost. When the battlefields around Kursk began to empty, they did not become peaceful immediately. Destroyed vehicles remained in fields. Some burned for hours. Others cooled into blackened steel. Minefields still waited beneath the ground. Unexploded shells remained. Trenches cut through farmland. Villages had been damaged or destroyed. Roads were scarred by tracks. Recovery crews moved among wrecks, searching for vehicles that could be repaired. A tank that looked destroyed from a distance might contain components worth saving. Weapons were removed. Radios, optics, ammunition, engines, tracks. The battlefield became a source of spare parts. For soldiers, the aftermath included tasks rarely shown in dramatic accounts. Counting, identifying, recovering, burying, repairing, writing reports, replacing crews, redistributing ammunition, trying to sleep. A major battle leaves behind administration. It also leaves memory. German veterans remembered minefields, artillery, Soviet tank attacks, dust, and the strain of repeated assaults. Soviet veterans remembered German armor, bombardment, counterattacks, and the enormous effort required to hold the defensive belts. Later histories turned these memories into larger narratives. Some emphasized German technical superiority. Some emphasized Soviet mass. Some described Prokhorovka as a simple crushing victory. Others reacted by portraying Soviet success as little more than numerical sacrifice. The reality resists those extremes. German tactical performance at Kursk was often effective. German weapons could be superior in specific engagements. Soviet tank losses could be very high. At the same time, the Soviet operational plan worked. The Red Army built a defense deep enough to prevent the German offensive from achieving its purpose. It committed reserves. Then it counterattacked on the shoulders of the salient. Germany failed to eliminate the Kursk bulge. It soon lost Oral, Belgorod, and Kharkov. That is the central fact. Kursk was not a magical moment when German military skill vanished. It was a moment when skill was no longer sufficient to restore strategic initiative. The war had become larger than the strengths of individual German formations. The Soviet Union could replace equipment on a scale Germany struggled to match. Its commanders had learned from earlier disasters. Its defensive preparations were deeper. Its artillery was stronger. Its reserves were larger. Its strategic planning increasingly connected defensive and offensive operations. For Germany, the consequences extended beyond the Eastern Front. The timing of Allied operations in the Mediterranean reminded German leaders that every armored division committed near Kursk existed inside a global war. The Luftwaffe faced multiple demands. The Navy fought in the Atlantic. Italy was weakening. Western Europe had to be defended. Germany could no longer treat the Soviet front as the only decisive theater demanding resources. That made the failure of Citadel even more costly. The offensive had concentrated forces at a moment when Germany needed flexibility everywhere. The return was limited. The salient remained. The enemy remained strong. And the reserves used in the operation had suffered losses and mechanical wear just as new emergencies appeared elsewhere. Yet the battle should not be reduced to inevitability. History is clearer after it happens. In the spring of 1943, German commanders did not possess a map showing the war through 1945. They knew their situation was dangerous. They did not know exactly how quickly it would deteriorate. Some believed Citadel offered a chance to damage Soviet offensive power. Some believed the operation should have begun earlier. Some thought it should not be launched. These disagreements matter because they show that the risks were understood. The operation was a choice. Its failure was not simply weather, bad luck, or one order from Hitler. The plan asked German forces to break a defense that had been built specifically to receive them. It depended on converging attacks. One pincer stalled. The other advanced farther, but could not produce the necessary breakthrough. Soviet reserves survived. Soviet counteroffensives began. The operation ended. The dust settled slowly. The strategic consequences did not. Return to the map. At the beginning of the story, the eye was drawn to the Kursk salient. A great Soviet bulge in the German line. Orel to the north. Belgorod and Kharkov to the south. The German plan imagined two arrows closing behind it. Now erase those arrows. Move the German line west. Orel is gone. Belgorod is gone. Kharkov is gone. The salient Germany intended to remove has become part of a broader Soviet advance. The map looks different because the war is different. This is why Kursk matters. Not because it was one perfect tank duel. Not because every famous legend about Prokhorovka is true. Not because German forces suddenly forgot how to fight. Kursk matters because Germany used a major concentration of armored strength in an attempt to regain initiative and failed. The Red Army absorbed the attack. Then it attacked in return. From this point onward, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front would spend much of the war trying to manage a retreat it could slow but not reverse permanently. The retreat would not be smooth. There would be hard defensive victories. Soviet offensives would fail in places. German armored formations would still counterattack with skill. Whole Soviet units would be destroyed. The front would pause, then move again. The direction, however, would remain west. For the men who fought at Kursk, that future was hidden. A crew repairing a tank did not know it would later fight in Ukraine. An infantryman digging a new defensive position did not know where the next winter would find him. A Soviet engineer removing mines did not know how many more rivers the Red Army would cross. They lived inside days, not historical eras. That is worth remembering in any long story of war. Maps make movement look clean. Arrows make campaigns look intentional. Dates create beginnings and endings. But war is lived through uncertainty. Most soldiers do not know that a battle is a turning point while they are inside it. They know the next order, the next road, the next meal, the next sound of artillery, the next night without enough sleep. Kursk was built from such moments. An engineer clearing a lane, a tank crew waiting behind him, an artillery observer watching a ridge, a mechanic replacing a failed component, an infantry platoon entering a trench, a Soviet gun crew holding fire until the range closed, a German commander studying a report that was already out of date, a reserve column moving toward a penetration, a staff officer drawing another line on a map. Together, those moments became an operation. The operation became a failure. And the failure became part of a larger transformation of the Eastern Front. There is a final temptation to see Kursk as a contest between machines. Tiger against T-34. Panther against Soviet armor. Ferdinand against anti-tank guns. The machines were real. Their strengths mattered. Their weaknesses mattered. But the larger lesson lay in systems. The Soviet defense succeeded because trenches, mines, artillery, infantry, anti-tank weapons, reserves, intelligence, and counter-offensive planning worked together well enough to absorb the attack. The German offensive failed because tactical excellence could not overcome defensive depth, lost surprise, mechanical friction, limited time, and strategic pressure elsewhere. The battlefield did not prove that technology was unimportant. It proved that technology alone was not enough. A powerful tank still needs a road. A road needs engineers. Engineers need protection. Protection needs artillery. Artillery needs ammunition. Ammunition needs transport. Transport needs fuel. Fuel needs railways. Railways need time. And time at Kursk belonged increasingly to the defender. Outside the command room, the summer night is warm. No snow presses against the window. The steppe is dark. Somewhere far away, the horizon flashes. A gun. Then another. The sound arrives later. On the table, the map remains under the lamp. The lines around Kursk are covered with pencil marks. Some are neat. Some have been erased. The original arrows no longer meet. The offensive is over. The war is not. And west of the battlefield, the road ahead is growing longer,